Two murder investigations from the case files of Lieutenant Joe Kenda. A savage knife attack leaves a middle-aged mother clinging to life.
This is an incredibly violent crime.
Kenda's on the hunt for a suspect with a twisted mind.
There were some things that just didn't make sense.
People behave in certain ways for a reason.
Police, open up!
Then,
Oh my God.
the discovery of a hidden confession opens the door to an age-old murder mystery.
1893.
Yeah, how about fell off my chair?
Murder is murder. There's no statute of limitations, even from the Old West.
I want you to leave now.
This isn't self-defense. You are lying pure and simple. This country has always been armed to the teeth, and it certainly was in the Old West. Death, murder, assault was a very common thing. No one was surprised by it. People expected it.
Northeast part of Colorado. Sheila Scott was in her kitchen baking cookies. She hears a knock.
Sheila, where's your phone?
And she finds that it's her neighbor, Jerry Denton.
Jerry, what happened?
Your phone, Sheila, I need it.
Jerry, you're back.
She's freaked that on his back there's blood.
Yeah, I need an ambulance. My wife's been stabbed. I think she's dying.
Across town, Sergeant Joe Kenda is enjoying lunch from one of his favorite local food joints.
There was a hamburger stand in Colorado Springs that's now unfortunately out of business that made giant, oversized hamburgers. They were wonderful.
How's the dog?
The kids love him. He's a pain in my ass. Keep pissing on the carpet.
Still isn't house broken yet?
Not yet, man. I'm trying my best. He won't listen to nothing I say.
I should try talking a little nicer to him.
Now you sound like my wife.
Dispatch to 4 Paul 1.
Go 4, Paul 1.
There's a call that comes over the radio, an attempted murder.
10-4, I'm on the way.
I guess duty calls. You gotta go.
When you receive a call in my line of work, just eat it or leave it and go do your job.
Good luck with the dog.
Yeah.
Hey, Skip.
Hey, Sergeant.
So what have we got?
2 victims, married couple, both suffered stab wounds.
I was one of the first detectives to arrive at the scene, and all we knew is that Jerry Denton, the husband, had a stab wound in his back, and his wife, Pat Denton, had actually been stabbed in the neck.
Took them both to the hospital. Jerry isn't in too bad shape, but word on his wife is she's unlikely to survive.
Any kids?
Yeah, they got 2, but they're both at school.
Jerry's a contractor for a development company, and Pat is a stay-at-home mom. And together, they have a nice little family.
So Jerry told the comm center that it was an intruder, but I'm not so sure we should rule him out just yet.
All right. Let's take a look inside.
The most common call that the police respond to is a domestic disturbance, where husbands and wives get into violent confrontations.
Was this something that happened between the two of them, or were there any other suspects?
This is where EMS found the body.
There's a large pool of blood in the kitchen, followed by a blood trail. It's apparent that she staggers and collapses on the floor and is bleeding profusely from a neck wound. Detective Arms tells me that the house phone line had been cut, which explains why the 911 call was made from a neighbor's house.
What have we got in here?
In the house, there was a pile of clothes on the floor. That seemed out of place for this crime scene.
Who do you think they belong to?
Could be any number of people.
Is it the husband's clothes? Is it somebody else's? Somebody got undressed in here. Why would they do that?
I've got an idea. Where's the bedroom at? Right this way.
So we went up to the master bedroom,
Wanna grab one of those?
found the husband's shoes, and compared the shoes to these.
That led us to believe that they were not Jerry's clothes.
What if the missus has a boyfriend? Dad comes home, finds this undressed person in his house, and he assumes he's not a nudist who came in to use the phone, and the knife comes out.
Let's go see what else we got.
We go back downstairs. We go looking around. We find the patio door has been broken.
Sergeant, here, check this out. Coins.
The physical evidence indicates this is a burglary. It's somebody who's doing a crime in this house, not a boyfriend of the wife, and not the husband.
So Pat and Jerry discover a burglar in the kitchen. He freaks and grabs a knife. And whoever he is shouldn't be too hard to find. If those are the suspect's clothes on the floor in there, we got a guy running around in his underwear. Let's go.
Now, why does he get undressed? Well, that's the $64 question. People behave in certain ways for a reason. We just don't know what it is.
Broadcast out to the officers in the immediate vicinity of the crime scene, warning them to be on the lookout for someone who is considered dangerous, would have only been wearing underwear and socks.
As the search commences, Kenda and Arms hope victim Jerry Denton might be able to bring some clarity to the investigation.
How's it going in here? Jerry, I'm Sergeant Kenda. You okay to talk?
Yeah, sure.
Do you know who did this to you and your wife?
Yes and no.
What do you mean?
There's this teen with brown hair. I don't know his name, but I think he lives on our street.
So now the question becomes simple. Which kid and in which house? This particular case involves a married couple who become victims of an incredibly violent crime. The husband knows that the perpetrator lives in the neighborhood.
Why don't you just start from the beginning?
Okay, well, it all started late this morning when I was at work. Yeah.
Something happened, but don't worry.
What happened?
Pat tells him that there's a neighbor kid that came to the house this morning at 10 o'clock, and she recognized him, so she let him in.
Pat said he was acting strangely, so she sent April to her room. And then she said he pulled out a knife and he was gonna rape her.
But she's able to talk him out of doing this, and is able to basically have him eventually leave the house without engaging in any type of sexual assault.
And obviously, I'm freaking out as she's telling me all this. Are you at the police station now?
No, I'm at home.
What?
I don't think we need to call cops, sweetheart.
Honey, this is serious. You could be in danger. But why don't you drive over to my office? You can spend the rest of the day here.
Okay, well, I have to take April to kindergarten anyway, so I will see you in a little bit.
And that's when you called the police to tell them what happened?
No, we didn't call you guys that time. Pat wouldn't let me.
Why not exactly?
One of the ways that Pat got the perpetrator out of the house was to promise not to call the police if he didn't harm her.
I should have put my foot down and called, but we didn't. And then when we got home,
Tells us that he and Pat got home in separate cars, but essentially at the same time. Pat walks into the house, and Jerry initially goes to check the mail. He sees that Pat's been stabbed in the neck.
You gotta let go.
He said he didn't know what to do. He took the knife out and tried to put a towel around her neck.
Look at me. Look at me. You're okay. Look at me.
And that's when he got attacked from behind.
I saw him just standing there. This brown-haired teen. He was going crazy and stuff.
Stay the away from me, man. You kill me, I'll kill you. I swear.
And then he ran out of the house.
Did you see where he went?
No, but I'm guessing he went home because he was just in his underwear and socks. Maybe Pat might know at house. I don't know.
Okay, Jerry. Thank you. Hope you get better soon.
Kenda makes necessary preparations.
So I notified the tactical unit commander that we may have a situation here where we're going to have to take a kid out of a house. I don't know yet. So they get their team assembled to stand by in the event that we determine location and identity.
In the meantime, detectives hope to gather more information from Pat Denton herself. But there's one problem.
Pat couldn't talk. She'd had surgery to repair her throat.
I know you're not supposed to talk.
So we explain who we are and what we're doing. And I said, I know you're not supposed to speak to me, but can you write?
Can you tell us the name of the person that did this to you?
She writes David.
You know his last name? How about where he lives?
Mrs. Denton writes directly across the street, one house to the left.
Now, hang in there. You're gonna be okay.
And then she wrote something else. I looked at it and it said, what?
I don't know why you, but we're gonna find the person that did this.
So I said, my dear, I know we will find him and we will punish him for what he has done.
Kenda dispatch.
Dispatch to Kenda.
With a name and address for their suspect,
10-4.
I'll be right over.
Kenda deploys the tactical team waiting on standby.
This is called a high-risk arrest. You're dealing with someone who exhibits violence, who announces he's insane. It is very dangerous.
Police, open up!
What?
David, where's David?
My son, he's in his bedroom.
All right, step outside, ma'am.
Well, what is this? David didn't do anything.
Ma'am, he's wanted in connection with an attempted murder that occurred this morning.
That's impossible. He's been with me all day. He's been sleeping.
Stay with her.
Out of the bed right now. Get out of the bed.
Hands on your head. Turn around to the bed. Hands behind your back.
What's going on? I didn't do anything.
David, where were you between 10 a.m. and 1 p.m.?
I've been sleeping.
Let's clear this up.
The shoes we found in that house, the crime scene, are a size 10. David's are a size 7.
Put on cuff. Sorry for the intrusion, David. Lynn, can you bring in Miss Andrews?
So at that point, we're kind of confused because we have David, but David's not our guy.
So much for the David lead. Apologies, Miss Andrews.
Wait. Are you guys looking for the other David?
The other David?
My friend David, he's been staying with us for a while. He's got some problems, I guess you could say.
Well, that would be the David that I'm looking for because he has a lot of problems and he's about to have another one. The tactical unit has made entry into the suspect residence.
Are you guys looking for the other David?
We found a kid named David, and he's the wrong David. So I speak to Mom, and the mother says that David Dodson has come to live with them.
He's a 17-year-old kid. He does fit the description.
I thought he seemed like a good kid. He's pretty quiet.
So why was he staying here?
Well, he moved to the Springs from Oklahoma City a couple months ago, but things weren't working out at home.
The mother explains that David Dodson, he's kind of a lost soul. She felt sorry for him, and she allowed him to move in.
Have you seen David at all since this morning? We think he might have returned to get some clothes.
No, he hasn't been back.
Where is he now? This kid is naked, he's on foot. He needs to find clothing, and he needs to find a way out because he assumes, quite correctly, that the police are on his heels.
Excuse me, Sergeant. Got a report of a stolen car, 2 blocks from the crime scene.
Just like that. Another lead. Is this connected? It's just too close not to be.
Let's go. Excuse me.
Detectives head out to follow up on the potential lead of the stolen car.
Well, no, but I do leave a spare under my bumper.
Back in the days, we all had those little stick-on hide-a-key things.
Was there anything of value in the car?
Not really, just some cash. And my boyfriend left some clothes in there.
Clothes.
This kid gets incredibly lucky. He finds a truck that happens to have jeans, a shirt, and some sneakers. How does that happen?
So now our man has clothes, he's got money, and he's got transport. Now, where does a fugitive run to? Predictable places.
All right, well, thank you.
They go find their mama, their girlfriend, or their money.
Lieutenant Kendra, dispatch.
So I'm thinking now that maybe he's going back to Oklahoma.
I need a polo put out.
We put out an alert to all agencies in Oklahoma. We're looking for this stolen car that may contain a male David Dodson. We describe him.
Colorado Springs authorities keep up the search for their fugitive. Turn up nothing. However, 2 days later, over 300 miles away in Oklahoma.
It looks like it, doesn't it?
It does.
5-4 dispatch. We got a matching vehicle, that Polo. Tag 870 Fox Ocean. Wolf. Hey, young man, what's your name?
Officers approached him.
David Dodson.
And he essentially blurted right out.
Stabbed 2 people in Colorado.
Go ahead and turn around for me.
Great. Simple enough.
Put your hand behind
Time to put handcuffs on you. We extradite him from Oklahoma to Colorado to face charges.
In addition to confessing to the crime, David Dodson makes a shocking claim.
He indicated that he had taken some LSD that morning and also had been drinking. And so he was in sort of a hazy state of mind, if you will, when this whole thing happened.
Detectives still have many questions, but luckily, there is someone who lived to tell the tale.
Pat Denton's recovering from her injuries, able to speak. She was going to be fine.
Did you know David Dodson prior to this?
I mean, I saw him around the neighborhood. That was about it.
Good morning.
I barely said 2 words to him. And then that morning, he shows up at the house. Hi.
Hi, I'm David from across the street. I was wondering if I could ask for a favor.
Oh, well, sure. What can I do for you?
This young man asked her for a cup of sugar.
How much do you need? April, why don't you go and play in your room for me, okay? Thank you.
Even though April was little, she saw him coming in and she could tell her mom was uncomfortable. Something was off.
Take your clothes off.
What?
Take your clothes off.
What? I'm sorry.
I started talking. I made up a story.
No, you don't want to do that, David. I'm done.
Yeah.
That was really thinking on her feet, and she stuck with it.
Is everything okay?
Not really.
Well, why don't we sit down and talk about it? Would you like some coffee? Or, yeah? Okay. Yeah, it's all right.
She eventually gets him to calm down.
If David had in fact taken LSD, it could explain his impressionable behavior.
Sometimes I feel like I'm dying, you know?
Yeah.
And nobody cares?
Within minutes, he was opening his heart to Pat.
Well, they should care.
She could tell he was a mess and genuinely saw this as an opportunity to get a fellow human being on the right path in life. That's just who she was.
You're not gonna call the cops, are you?
No, I promise. I'm not going to call the cops. David, if you'll excuse me, I really need to get my daughter to kindergarten. So,
She was very, very fortunate that she was able to talk him out of it.
Kenda believes that during the first encounter, David noticed
that as the day wears on, and he's still suffering from the effects of the LSD, but he decides now it's time to burglarize their house. When he sees Mrs. Denton come home, he then changes his mind. He decides to carry out what he was going to do before. He cuts the phone line and he strips his clothes off. It doesn't make any sense that he does that, but that's what he does.
As Pat went to scream, he lunged at her and stabbed where the noise was coming from, which is essentially why he got her in the throat. After David stabs Pat, Jerry comes in the house to try to help his wife. And it's at that point when Jerry's focused on his wife that David stabs Jerry in the back.
Stay away from me! You kill me, I'll kill you, I swear to God.
Well, you're lucky to be alive.
The surgeon said the of an inch. An eighth of an inch is nothing. In her case, it meant her life.
She lived. So did Jerry. That's what really matters. They lived.
David Dodson pleads guilty and is sentenced to 16 years for attempted murder and 14 years for assault in the first degree.
People are dangerous. When you see something, you tell someone. You don't rely on your word. Oh, please. To who? A criminal? Call the police. Call the police.
Coming up,
Dad, there's something kind of weird on here.
a startling discovery.
Oh my God.
Reveals a murderous history.
1893.
Yeah. We found what is probably a dark family secret.
At this point, I'm thinking there's got to be something else.
Marguerite Buckley.
This is truly a voice from the grave.
Just 10 miles down of Fountain, Jim Eggleston has his hands full with his new home.
When we purchased the home, we knew we would have to do a lot of renovation because it was a very old home. We had to strip the molding from the windows so I could refinish them.
Here you go, honey.
I was trying to be very easy pulling all the molding off and then handing it to my daughter.
Hey, Dad, there's something kind of weird on here. It looks like handwriting.
Let me see. Yeah, you're right.
It was in pencil. It was hard to read at first because it was a different penmanship, you know, an old-time penmanship.
I, John W. Spicer, of the city of Fountain, something. Oh my God.
When I saw the word murder, I said, holy, this is a murder confession.
The next morning, at the El Paso County District Attorney's Office, investigator Larry Martin is catching up on some paperwork.
Hey, Larry.
Oh, hey, Chief, how you doing?
Well, we've got something. I was hoping you could take a look at it. It was on the back of a piece of molding in an old house in Fountain.
My chief said that he'd gotten a call from the Colorado Bureau of Investigation advising that they had in their possession a possible murder confession, so they contacted the district attorney's office to see if we would be willing to open an investigation.
That's mostly obscured by all this paint and stuff.
The lab at CBI is working on cleaning it up without removing the writing.
Right.
It's in pencil.
Upon examining this, I noticed right away that some particular words jumped out at me. I did kill and willfully murder.
Signed John Spicer. And there's this.
1893?
Yep.
Wow.
As a member of a modern police force, you don't get an opportunity to open a window into the past very often. In 1986, we ran across something extremely unusual before that day.
Martin's first step will be determining whether this is a bona fide confession to an 1893 murder or a hoax.
Larry Martin goes to the Pioneer Museum to see what records they had on when the house was built.
The Pioneers Museum houses records from Colorado Springs and El Paso County, and it's our largest local depository of historical information in the area.
Here's the deed to the property that you asked about.
The house was built in 1899. It's one of the first two-story homes built in the area, and it was a private residence.
It was owned by the Perkins family, and the builder was a John Spicer.
It's the guy who wrote the confession.
Oh. So now it's starting to make sense. He built the house in 1899.
John Spicer was a carpenter. Many families around the area hired him to help build their homes.
Now, this was 6 years after the reported murder took place.
Someone once said guilt is a terrible thing, and it is. Release of that burden becomes paramount as people age.
John Spicer nailed it to a wall, hoping that in sometime in the very far future, maybe somebody would find it. Now I'm thinking, this is no hoax. I've got a case that dates back 100 years, and where am I going to find the information I need?
One possibility is Colorado Springs Police. Could they have a century-old case file on this murder?
Larry, hey, Joe, take a look at this.
So I went to Joe, and once I laid it out to him, his eyes bugged out. Yeah, he was very interested in this.
Wow.
This was an opportunity to look at things that I've always been interested in. History, one of my passions, and the Old West.
So how can I help? I think you can go through the police records and see if there's anything on this murder on the file.
I don't have to. They don't exist. CSPD wasn't around in 1893.
The actual municipal police department was before that time. There were deputy marshals, and they were the law, and they dispensed justice on the spot in most cases.
So no police. The marshal didn't do much investigating back then. I say your best bet's the library.
Yeah, that was my next step. give it a shot.
Listen, I know it's your case. If you need any help, let me know. I'd love to help out.
Yeah, I will. Thanks, Joe.
So I was able to go to the Penrose Public Library and do some research on their old newspaper articles. In my research, though, I came across an article from the late 1950s where it mentioned a lady who was helping a family from Illinois find headstones for burial sites for some of the Locke and Spicer families.
Marguerite Buckley.
Is that a lead that I can maybe get more information on who John Spicer was?
Later that afternoon, Martin finds a phone number in the directory and gives it a try.
Hi, I'm looking for a Marguerite Buckley.
This is she.
Hi, Marguerite. This is Detective Larry Martin. I'm doing a little bit of research on a man named John Spicer, and I was wondering if you knew anything about him.
Well, I do. John Spicer was my father.
Chair, what? I've got the daughter to the confessed killer?
All right, thank you so much, Ernie. All right, bye.
I called Joe and I said, let's go.
At her home, 89-year-old Marguerite Spicer Buckley happily shares stories of her father.
My dad had a lot of different jobs when I was growing up.
Marguerite explained he was sort of a general laborer. He worked in a railroad. He was a carpenter. He'd done what he had to do to survive and feed his family.
So he was a good father?
Well, not exactly. When he wasn't working, he was drinking somewhere.
She was very blunt that her dad was an ugly drunk. He was very mean. And when he started drinking, she would actually pour his whiskey for him and give him a lot of whiskey because she wanted him to pass out very quickly.
Daddy girl!
Sorry, Pop.
I ought to teach you a lesson for being so careless. Get him outside before I change my mind.
Gambling, he got into that too.
In the 1880s, 1890s, gambling went hand in hand with drinking. That was their entertainment.
Honest with you, the reason I'm doing a history on him is he may have committed a murder.
We found what we believe to be a confession written by your father.
Her demeanor changed instantly.
If you don't mind, I want you to leave now. I'm tired. I don't think that I could be of any more use to you.
Thank you, man.
When you interview people as much as us, you know when you touch a nerve. You've found what is probably a dark family secret that they really don't want you to know. We need to get to the bottom of this. The Colorado Bureau of Investigation has been working on deciphering a confession to an 1893 murder. We believe that John Spicer killed someone, and we also believe that his daughter, Marguerite, knows something about it.
This is Investigator Martin.
I eventually get a telephone call from Agent Mooney of the Colorado Bureau of Investigation.
I've been working on this piece of wood you brought me.
He said he was able to decipher the name of the victim, John Sebastian.
Hey, this is great.
This is critical information, which we didn't have before. So now we have to look at this John Sebastian.
All right, we'll talk to you soon.
Who is he?
Martin and Kenda return to the Pioneers Museum to look through old city directories for traces of their victim.
And bang, 1893, we find the name John J. Sebastian. Lived in Colorado Springs, worked for the railroad.
The last time his name appears in the city directory is 1893. In the 1894 edition and beyond, no John Sebastian. Did he dry up and blow away, or did John Spicer kill him?
Once we learn about John Sebastian, it's clear we need to talk to Marguerite again to find out, did she know the Sebastian family? So Joe and I went down. We actually brought her some flowers, kind of a peace offering.
I know we sort of ended on a bad note.
Please, just sit down. I'm so glad you came back. It's time the truth came out.
I knew then, okay, here it comes.
The story you're about to hear from me was told me by my mother, Spicer.
John Spicer told his wife it'd been hard to break some wild horses. And he was building a fence to contain these horses.
He heard a man sneaking up on him.
Give me your money. I'll cut you. Give me your money. Come on. What you got?
Spicer was forced to defend himself.
Marguerite tells me that her father struck this man in the head and it killed him. Marguerite said her dad searched through the man's pockets to try to find out who this person was, but there was no identification on him whatsoever.
He went and told the marshal who came out to investigate, and he determined that he had killed the man in self-defense.
The man who died, could his name have been John Sebastian?
No, I don't recognize the name. But the marshal always said that he probably was a drifter.
At this point, I'm thinking, there's got to be something else.
Thank you so much. Pleasure. Why would Spicer write John Sebastian on the confession?
Maybe because he didn't want to tell his family the whole story. Maybe John Spicer isn't the hero he claimed to be.
I think Spicer's lying, pure and simple. You didn't talk to anybody, except to your wife. And when you talked to her, you lied to her.
Later that day, a call from the Colorado Bureau of Investigation sheds some more light on Kenda's theory.
Finally able to make out most of the confession. Spicer pretty much lays out everything. Apparently he hits this guy John Sebastian with a club to rob him for $5,000 worth of cash and jewelry.
This isn't self-defense. Spicer killed the guy for a reason.
That's a lot of money in 1893. In today's monetary value, that would be around $130,000 probably. There is no way John Sebastian could have earned that kind of money working for the railroad.
There are only two ways you can have that kind of money: through being a gold miner and having a successful claim in the mountains, or through gambling. And his daughter Marguerite tells us that he was a gambler. And I believe that's the common thread between John Spicer and Sebastian.
Put your money in, Sebastian.
John Spicer and John Sebastian met, perhaps they drank.
Bitch.
On this particular day, John Sebastian was the big winner. He wiped everybody out, not only their money, but their rings, their watches, and any jewelry they may have had on them.
Hand it over, Spicer.
John Spicer knew the wife was not going to be happy. He had squandered away all of his money.
Well, boys, it's been fun.
He needed to somehow get that money back.
Hey, Jada.
It's at this point, John Spicer himself lays out what happened next.
To whomever may happen to find this confession, on or about the first day of March, 1993, I, John W. Spicer, did kill and willfully murder with a club one John J. Sebastian. For his money and jewelry to the value of $5,000. The hope that when I'm gone, this confession may be found and at last clear up the darkest mystery that ever embraced one in human murder. In prayer for the partial salvation of my soul.
John Spicer left John Sebastian there to die, and probably wild animals would have got to it. The remains would never have been found.
With no one alive to arrest, Martin files a report with the district attorney's office, officially closing the case.
Larry Martin decided to...
April 15th, 2014 began like an ordinary spring morning in Calgary. The city was waking slowly beneath a cold Canadian sky, the streets carrying the first signs of another weekday. In Brentwood, houses stood quietly along familiar residential streets. Curtains were drawn. Porch lights were beginning to disappear beneath the growing daylight. Cars moved through intersections. Somewhere, people were preparing for work. Somewhere else, students were thinking about exams, summer plans, and what they would do now that another semester was almost over. But inside one house on Butler Crescent, 5 young lives had already ended. Only a few hours earlier, that house had been filled with the ordinary term. Friends had gathered together. They talked, laughed, ate, and spent time with people they knew. It was the kind of night that should have become a memory of friendship, youth, and the beginning of summer. Instead, it became one of the darkest nights Calgary had ever experienced. 5 people were dead. Lawrence Hong, Katie Paris, Jordan Segura, Josh Hunter, Zachariah Rathwell. They were not strangers passing through the same place by coincidence. They were young people with families, friendships, ambitions, personalities, and futures that had once seemed to stretch endlessly ahead of them. Their lives were still being written when, in less than a minute, everything changed. And the person responsible was not an unknown intruder who had broken into the house from the darkness outside. He was already inside. He was someone the group knew. His name was Matthew DeGrood. He was 22 years old. He was familiar with some of the people at the gathering. He was not a masked stranger arriving from somewhere beyond the neighborhood. He was standing among them as the night unfolded, occupying the same space, breathing the same air, existing within the same ordinary celebration. And yet, somewhere inside his mind, reality had begun to fracture. In the days leading up to the killings, there had been signs. Strange messages, statements. Talk of vampires, the apocalypse, and a blood moon. A belief that other people were talking about him. A growing world of paranoia that seemed to exist only inside his mind, but which would eventually collide violently with the real world. At the time, nobody at that gathering could have known what those signs meant. Perhaps some people simply thought Matthew was acting strangely. Perhaps others assumed he was having a difficult night. Perhaps nobody imagined that the strange behavior was the beginning of something much more dangerous. That is one of the most unsettling elements of the Brentwood 5 murders. There was no warning siren announcing that a tragedy was coming. There was no stranger pounding on the front door. There was no obvious enemy waiting outside. There was simply a group of young people enjoying a night together, while one person among them was slipping deeper into a reality that the others could not see. And then, sometime around 1 o'clock in the morning, several people left the house to get food. For a brief moment, the world outside continued exactly as it had before. Cars traveled along Calgary's roads. The city remained largely unaware. Inside the house, however, the number of people had changed. The atmosphere had changed. And the distance between an ordinary university celebration and a massacre had become almost impossibly. Josh Hunter, Katie Paris, and Jordan Segura were in the living room. Zachariah Rathwell was near the kitchen. Matthew DeGrood was there too. 5 young people were about to become victims. One young man was about to become their killer. According to the evidence later presented in court, DeGrood went into the kitchen and took a large knife. What happened next unfolded with terrifying speed. There was no long confrontation. No prolonged argument that warned everyone something was about to happen. The violence came suddenly. Zachariah Rathwell was attacked first. Then DeGrood moved toward the others. The ordinary room where friends had been spending time together became a place of panic and violence. Josh Hunter was attacked. Jordan Segura was attacked. Katie Paris was attacked. Lawrence Hong, still asleep, was also attacked. The entire assault took less than a minute. Less than 60 seconds. A period of time shorter than many songs. Shorter than the average phone call. Shorter than the time it takes to walk from one room to another. But in that fraction of an hour, 5 futures disappeared. 5 families would soon receive the kind of phone call no parent ever expects. 5 groups of friends would wake up the next morning and discover that people they had known only hours earlier were gone. And Calgary would wake to a crime scene that seemed over. Josh Hunter was still alive. Despite his injuries, somehow, he managed to get up. He moved toward the outside. He ran. Behind him, Matthew DeGrood followed with the knife. Imagine the confusion of that moment. A quiet residential neighborhood in the middle of the night. A young man running for his life. Another person pursuing him. People returning from a late-night trip for food, expecting to walk back into an ordinary gathering, suddenly seeing something they could never have imagined. The night had transformed before their eyes. Josh eventually collapsed on the grass outside the house. The people who had just returned were confronted with the reality of what had happened. There was blood. There was panic. There were bodies inside. And there was still a man nearby who had been holding the weapon. One of the friends, Brendan, followed DeGrood. What happened next would become one of the strangest and most disturbing moments in the entire case. DeGrood handed the blood-covered knife to Brendan. He referred to what had happened as the night of the long knives. Then he wiped his blood-covered hands onto Brendan's hands and described them as blood brothers. The words were bizarre. The behavior was bizarre. But behind those words was something even more disturbing. A mind apparently struggling to distinguish between reality. Brendan called 911. Within minutes, the quiet neighborhood became surrounded by police and emergency responders. Officers moved toward the house. Paramedics rushed to the scene. The first responders entered a home that had only moments earlier been occupied by a group of young people celebrating together. Now it was a crime scene. Zachariah Rathwell was dead. Jordan Segura was dead. Lawrence Hong was dead. Josh Hunter and Katie Paris were still showing signs of life, and both were rushed toward medical care. But the injuries were catastrophic. They would not survive. 5 people. 5 lives. 1 house. 1 attack. Less than a minute. The numbers were almost impossible to process. For investigators, the immediate question was not only what had happened, but where the attacker had gone. Matthew DeGrood had left the scene. Police began searching the surrounding area. And there was another extraordinary complication. The suspect they were searching for was not an unknown name to Calgary's police community. Matthew's father, Doug DeGrood, was a veteran senior officer with the Calgary Police Service. That connection added another layer of shock to an already devastating case. A police officer's son was now suspected of committing one of the most horrifying mass killings the city had ever. When police informed him that Matthew was believed to be responsible for the killings. There are moments in a criminal investigation when professional duty and personal horror collide so completely that language almost fails. This was one of them. A father who had spent years serving his city was suddenly facing the possibility that his own son had become the person police were hunting. And somewhere nearby, Matthew was still moving through the night. He was eventually located roughly half an hour after the attack. Police surrounded him. The search ended. The suspect was taken into custody. But the questions had only begun. Why? Why these 5 people? Why that night? Why inside a house filled with friends? Why did a young man who had known some of these people suddenly turn on them? And perhaps the most difficult question of all was one that would dominate the case for years. Was Matthew DeGrood fully aware of what he was doing? At first glance, the answer might seem obvious. 5 people had been stabbed. A weapon had been used. Witnesses had seen what happened. Matthew was identified as the attacker. But criminal responsibility is not determined solely by establishing who physically caused a death. The law also asks what was happening inside the accused person's mind. And that question would become the central battlefield of the Brent. Discover that the events of April 15th had not emerged from nowhere. In the days before the killings, Matthew's behavior had become increasingly strange. He had reportedly been preoccupied with ideas involving vampires. He bought garlic because he believed it could protect him. He spoke about the apocalypse. He talked about a blood moon. He sent unusual messages to people close to him. His thoughts appeared increasingly disorganized. He seemed convinced that other people were talking about him. And beneath all of it was a growing sense that the world around him was dangerous. The ordinary people he encountered were becoming characters in a private nightmare. According to evidence later presented in court, his beliefs became even more extreme. He believed he had a special identity. He believed other people belonged to secret or supernatural groups. He believed he was surrounded by enemies. He reported hearing a male voice that he believed was Satan. And ultimately, he believed that the 5 people in that house represented a threat to his own survival. In his distorted reality, the attack was not simply an act of violence. It was, in his mind, an attempt to survive. That does not erase what happened. It does not bring back the 5 people who died. It does not remove the devastation carried by their families. And it does not make the case any easier to understand. at the center of the story. How can someone commit an act so devastating and yet be so detached from the reality of what he is doing? How does a mind transform friends and acquaintances into enemies? How does paranoia become conviction? How does conviction become action? And how does a normal night at a university celebration turn, in less than a minute, into a massacre? Those questions would eventually take investigators into psychiatric assessments, courtroom testimony, and years of debate about mental illness and criminal responsibility. But before the courtrooms, before the experts, before the legal arguments, there were 5 people. It is important to remember that, because true crime stories can easily become stories about the offender. His face appears in headlines. His words are repeated. His psychological state becomes the subject of expert analysis. His name becomes attached to the crime. But on that April night, 5 other names were written into history against their will. Lawrence Hong had a life beyond that house. Katie Paris had a life beyond that night. Jordan Segura had a life beyond the headlines. Josh Hunter had dreams, friendships, and people who expected to see him again. Zachariah Rathwell had a future that was supposed to continue. None of them knew that their final hours were approaching. None of them could have known that the last gathering they would ever attend. And none of them could have imagined that the person standing among them would soon become the center of a criminal case that would challenge the boundaries between violence, mental illness, responsibility, and justice. For their families, April 15th would never again be just another date. It would become a dividing line. Before April 15th. After April 15th. Before the phone call. After the phone call. Before the moment when their loved one was still alive somewhere in Calgary. After the moment when that future disappeared. Years later, Calgary would still remember the Brentwood 5. A memorial would be created in their honor. Their names would continue to be spoken. Their lives would continue to matter. But the questions surrounding their deaths would remain. Because the Brentwood 5 murders were not simply a story about 5 people killed during a university celebration. They were a story about how quickly reality can change. About how an invisible psychological crisis can deepen while the outside world continues moving normally. About how people can stand beside someone who is suffering and have no idea how far that person's mind has traveled from reality. And about what happens when that internal world collides with 5 completely innocent lives. On the night of April 14th, 2014, friends, food, conversation, and the freedom that comes with the end of a semester. By the time the sun rose over Calgary, 5 families had been shattered. The house was no longer a place of celebration. It was a crime scene. The people who had walked through its doors as friends were gone. And somewhere in the aftermath, investigators began trying to reconstruct the final minutes of 5 young lives. They would have to examine every detail, every movement, every message, every strange statement, every decision made before the attack. They would have to understand Matthew DeGrude's state of mind, not simply on the night of the murders, but in the days and weeks leading up to them. And eventually, a courtroom would be asked to confront a question with no easy answer. When a person's mind becomes so detached from reality that he believes murder is an act of self-defense, can the law treat him in the same way as someone who understands exactly what he is doing? That question would determine Matthew DeGrude's fate. But before that question could be answered, there was another question that mattered even more. Who were the 5 people whose lives ended that night? To understand the tragedy of Brentwood, we cannot begin with the man holding the knife. We have to begin with the people who never knew they were about to become victims. Because before they were the Brentwood 5, they were Lawrence, Katie, they were loved. They had plans. And on the night they died, they were simply spending time together. They had no reason to believe that the final minutes of their lives were already approaching. And that is where the story truly begins. There are nights that seem unimportant while they are happening. They begin without ceremony. People arrive carrying food, jackets, backpacks, drinks, and the small distractions of everyday life. Someone tells a joke. Someone checks a phone. Someone complains about being tired. Someone talks about an exam that is finally over. Someone makes plans for the weekend. Nothing about the evening feels historic. Nothing suggests that years later, people will remember the exact house, the exact street, the exact date. That was the atmosphere in Brentwood on April 14th, 2014. Calgary was moving into spring, although spring in Alberta did not necessarily mean warmth. The air could still carry a sharp chill after sunset. The daylight lingered a little longer than it had during winter, but darkness still settled over residential streets with enough weight to make familiar houses look different. On Butler Crescent, however, the focus was not on the weather. It was on the people inside one particular home. The semester was ending. For university students, that transition carries a peculiar kind of freedom. Exams and early mornings begin to fall away. For a short time, there is permission to breathe. The pressure of school gives way to conversations about summer, music, friends, travel, work, and whatever might come next. That was why the gathering mattered. It was not a grand event. It did not need to be. The people there were young enough that an ordinary night together could feel like an occasion. Some had known each other for years. Some shared connections through school. Others were connected through friendship circles that had gradually overlapped. They were not gathered together because of anything extraordinary. They were simply friends spending time together. And among them was a 22-year-old man named Matthew DeGrood. To someone looking at the evening from the outside, his presence would not necessarily have seemed unusual. He knew people there. He belonged in the social environment. He was not walking into a room full of strangers. That detail would become crucial later. Because when investigators eventually reconstructed the massacre, they were not trying to explain why an unknown intruder had entered the house. They were trying to understand why someone who had been accepted into that social circle had suddenly become the source of unimaginable violence. At the beginning of the evening, nobody knew that such a question would ever need to be asked. The house was simply a place where friends could gather from room to room. People sat together. People separated into smaller groups. The kind of informal rhythm that happens naturally when young people spend an evening together. And somewhere within that ordinary rhythm, Matthew's behavior began to look different. It is easy, after a tragedy, to look backward and connect every strange detail into a pattern. That is one of the dangers of hindsight. Once we know what happened, every unusual sentence can appear like a warning. Every odd message can seem like a confession. Every strange action can appear to contain a hidden meaning. But the people around Matthew did not have the luxury of hindsight. They were living through the evening without knowing the ending. They could not see the full picture. They could only see fragments. One strange comment. One unusual belief. One awkward interaction. One person behaving differently. And fragments rarely look dangerous when they are isolated. In the days leading up to the gathering, however, Matthew had reportedly been behaving in increasingly unusual ways. His communications had become strange and difficult to understand. He appeared preoccupied with ideas that did not fit ordinary reality. He talked about vampires. He talked about the apocalypse. He became focused on the blood moon. And then there was the garlic. It was such a small object, only meant nothing. But Matthew reportedly purchased garlic because he believed he needed protection from vampires. To another person, that might have sounded like a joke. It might have been dismissed as eccentric behavior. It might have produced a laugh. But according to the evidence that would later emerge, Matthew's fears were not simply playful. He appeared to believe them. His mind was constructing a world in which supernatural threats were real and danger was everywhere. That world was becoming increasingly difficult for him to separate from reality. The people around him did not necessarily understand that. How could they? Mental illness is not always visible. A person can look physically healthy while experiencing a psychological crisis that is impossible for everyone else to see. A person can speak in complete sentences while the meaning behind those sentences is becoming increasingly detached from reality. A person can walk into a room, sit beside friends, and appear present while internally experiencing something completely different. That is part of what makes the events in Brentwood so difficult to understand. Matthew did not arrive wearing a sign announcing that he was experiencing a psychiatric emergency. He arrived as a young man among other young people. And the night continued. At some point, the group began settling into the later hours. The energy at midnight have a different feeling from the beginning of a party. People become tired. Conversations become quieter. Some leave. Others remain. The group became smaller. Eventually, a number of people decided to leave the house to get food from McDonald's. It was a completely ordinary decision. Perhaps they were hungry. Perhaps they wanted something familiar after a long night. Perhaps nobody thought twice about the fact that they were leaving 5 people behind. They stepped out into the Calgary night. The distance between the house and the restaurant was part of an ordinary routine. There was no reason for anyone to believe that those people leaving were unknowingly stepping away from a scene that would soon become a massacre. When they left, the house still contained 5 young people and Matthew. Lawrence Hong was asleep on a couch. Josh Hunter, Katie Paris, and Jordan Segura were in the living room. Zachariah Rathwell was near the kitchen. The arrangement of people mattered. The locations mattered. The seconds that followed mattered. But none of the people inside knew that they were standing at the edge of an event that would take only moments to unfold. There is something particularly unsettling about the idea of that final ordinary moment. Perhaps Lawrence Hong was simply sleeping. Perhaps the others were talking. Perhaps someone was thinking about food, thinking about what the next day would bring. None of them could know that there would be no next ordinary day. Then Matthew went toward the kitchen. A knife was taken. And the world inside that house changed. The first victim was Zachariah Rathwell. The attack was sudden. The details presented later in court showed that the violence was not the result of a long confrontation between 2 groups. There was no extended battle. There was no opportunity for the people inside to understand what was happening before it had already begun. The knife moved from one person to another. The room that had been part of an ordinary social gathering became a place of terror. Zachariah was attacked. Then Matthew moved toward the living room. Josh Hunter was attacked. Jordan Segura was attacked. Katie Paris was attacked. And Lawrence Hong, still asleep, was also attacked. The speed of the assault is one of the most difficult elements to comprehend. The entire attack took less than a minute. A minute is almost nothing when measured against a human life. It takes longer to make a cup of coffee, longer to brush your teeth, longer to read a short text message. But inside that house, less than 60 seconds was enough to erase 5 futures. The people who had been alive moments earlier were suddenly critically injured or dying. And yet, outside the house, another haunting feature of the case. Mass violence does not always announce itself to the world. Sometimes it happens behind ordinary walls on an ordinary street while the rest of the city continues sleeping. Cars still move. Streetlights still glow. Neighbors remain inside their homes. The world does not stop because something terrible has happened in one room. And for those first few moments, that is exactly what happened in Brentwood. The city continued. Inside the house, however, Josh Hunter was still alive. Somehow, despite his injuries, he managed to move. He got outside. He ran. Perhaps instinct took over. There is a point in extreme danger when the body seems to act before the mind can process what is happening. Run. Get away. Find someone. Survive. Josh ran toward the outside of the house. Matthew followed. The people who had left for food were returning at almost exactly the wrong moment. They had gone out expecting to come back to the same atmosphere they had left. Instead, they saw Josh. They saw the pursuit. They realized that something terrible had happened. One of them, Brendan, followed Matthew. The scene was chaotic. It was no longer a private gathering. It was now an emergency. And then came one who handed Brendan the knife. The weapon was covered in blood. Instead of behaving like someone who had just committed a horrific attack, Matthew spoke in a way that seemed disconnected from the reality surrounding him. He referred to the night as the night of the long knives. Then he wiped his blood-covered hands onto Brendan's hands. He called them blood brothers. The words would later become important because they appeared to offer a glimpse into Matthew's mental state. He seemed to be giving meaning to what had happened through a private framework that did not match the reality everyone else was witnessing. 5 people had been attacked. One young man was dying outside. Friends were staring at blood and trying to understand what had happened. And Matthew was talking about blood brothers. Brendan called 911. That call would begin the next stage of the tragedy. Police were dispatched. Paramedics were dispatched. The emergency response moved quickly. But for the people inside the house, there was already nothing that could undo what had happened. When officers entered, they found the aftermath of a massacre. The ordinary details of the home remained. Furniture, walls, personal belongings, objects that had belonged to ordinary life. But the meaning of the space had changed completely. This was no longer a place where friends had gathered to celebrate the end of a semester. It was others were critically injured. Josh Hunter and Katie Paris were taken for emergency medical treatment. The hope was that they might survive, but the injuries were too severe. They would later die. 5 names were now connected forever to the address. Lawrence Hong, Katie Paris, Jordan Segura, Josh Hunter, Zachariah Rathwell. 5 people who had begun the evening as living, breathing human beings with plans for the future. Now their families would have to learn that those futures had ended. The police investigation immediately expanded beyond the house. Matthew had left. Officers began searching for him. The suspect was known. His identity was not a mystery. His connection to the scene was not a mystery. But locating him was still urgent. And as investigators searched, another painful fact emerged. Matthew's father was Doug DeGrude, a veteran officer with the Calgary Police Service. The connection created an extraordinary emotional dimension to the investigation. Police were not simply looking for a suspect. A family was also looking for a son. Doug DeGrude had been searching for Matthew when he learned what had happened. The person he was trying to locate was not simply a missing young man. He was now believed to be responsible for 5 deaths. The contrast was almost had been built around protecting the public, was suddenly confronted with the possibility that his own child had caused a catastrophe. For investigators, however, the priority remained the same. Find Matthew. Secure the area. Protect the public. Understand what happened. Approximately half an hour after the attack, Matthew was located not far from the scene. Police surrounded him. The search ended. He was taken into custody. The immediate danger was over. But the investigation was only beginning. Because even before the first interviews were complete, investigators were confronted with something unusual. Matthew's statements did not sound like the statements of someone who had committed a crime and was simply trying to escape punishment. His explanations appeared to come from a completely different reality. He reportedly believed that he had been acting to protect himself. He believed the people he attacked were going to kill him. That belief would become one of the central facts of the case. It would also become one of the most difficult things for the public to understand. How could a person look at 5 friends and see enemies? How could someone see a threat where there was none? How could an imagined danger become so convincing that it justified, in his own mind, an act of deadly violence? Those questions would eventually lead doctors, lawyers, into territory of psychosis and criminal responsibility. But that came later. In the immediate aftermath, there were 5 families waiting for answers. There were parents who would soon learn that their children were never coming home. There were friends who would replay the night again and again, searching for the moment when they might have noticed something. There were witnesses who would carry images from that night for the rest of their lives. And there was a city trying to understand how one of its university neighborhoods had become the scene of such extraordinary violence. For many people in Calgary, the question was simple. How could this happen here? But for the families of the 5 victims, the question was much more personal. Why them? Why did their loved ones have to die? What could have been done? Could anyone have recognized what was happening inside Matthew's mind? Was there a moment when someone could have intervened? Was there a warning hidden in the strange messages, the talk of vampires, the fear of the apocalypse, the fixation on blood and supernatural threats? Or were those signs impossible to interpret until after the tragedy had already happened? These questions would haunt the case, and they would also shape the courtroom battle that followed, because the prosecution did not need to prove that Matthew had physically killed the 5 people. That fact was largely established. The difficult issue was whether he understood it. That distinction would determine whether he would be treated as a criminally responsible killer or as someone whose mental illness had destroyed his ability to understand reality. For the families, however, legal definitions could never fully describe what had happened. A legal judgment could determine responsibility. It could determine custody. It could determine treatment. It could determine what happened to Matthew. But it could not determine what happened to the 5 people who were no longer there. Their absence would remain. At family gatherings, there would be an empty place. At birthdays, there would be an absent voice. At holidays, memories would become reminders of someone missing. The people who loved them would have to continue living in a world that had suddenly become smaller. And that is why the story of the Brentwood 5 cannot be reduced to the name of the man who killed them. Matthew DeGrude became the central figure in the legal story. But Lawrence Hong, Katie Paris, Jordan Segura, Josh Hunter, and Zachariah Rathwell were the center of the human story. They were young people at the beginning of adulthood. Their lives were not defined by how they died. They should be remembered for how they lived, for their families, for their friendships, for their interests, for the ordinary moments that existed before the headlines. The 5 names would eventually become known collectively, simply 5 separate people, each with a different story. And before we follow the investigation, before we enter the courtroom, before we examine Matthew's fractured reality, we need to step back. We need to return to the people inside that house. Because the best way to understand the magnitude of what was lost is not to begin with the knife. It is to begin with the lives that existed before it. 5 young people walked into that night expecting to walk back out of it. They never did. And the next part of the story belongs to them. Before the headlines, before the police tape, before the courtroom arguments and psychiatric assessments, there were 5 young people who had no idea that their names would one day be spoken together. Lawrence Hong, Katie Paris, Jordan Segura, Josh Hunter, Zachariah Rathwell. The phrase Brentwood 5 would eventually become a shorthand for one of Calgary's most devastating crimes. It would appear in newspapers, television reports, podcasts, court documents, memorials, and conversations about mental illness and criminal responsibility. But a name like that can hide something important. It can make 5 individual human beings sound like a statistic. 5 victims. 5 deaths. 5 names in a case file. 5 people inside one house. Each of them had a life before that night. Each had people who knew their voices. People who knew their habits. People who knew what made them laugh. People who knew what they wanted to become. People who expected to see them again. That is the part of the story that can be lost when a crime is reduced to its most shocking details. The knife is remembered. The house is remembered. The killer is remembered. But the people who were killed deserve more than the final minutes of their lives. They deserve the lives that came before. Lawrence Hong was one of those 5 people. On the night of April 14th, he was not expecting to become part of a historic crime. He was simply another young person spending time with friends. At some point during the night, he fell asleep on a couch. There is something painfully ordinary about that detail. Sleep is one of the most defenseless states a human being can enter. When someone closes their eyes at the end of a long day, the expectation is that the world will remain safe while they rest. Lawrence had no reason to believe otherwise. He was surrounded by people he knew. He was inside a house where a gathering was taking place. There was no obvious sign that danger was approaching. He was simply asleep. And that ordinary act would become part of one of the most tragic moments of the night. Katie Paris was there too. Katie was young, surrounded by everyone together. Her life, like the lives of the others, extended far beyond the house on Butler Crescent. There were people who loved her. There were memories of her that existed long before the tragedy. There were conversations she had once had that would later be replayed in the minds of people who knew her. There were ordinary plans that would never happen. That is one of the cruelest things about sudden death. It does not only take away the present, it also destroys every future moment that had seemed so certain. A birthday that will never arrive. A conversation that will never happen. A graduation, a relationship, a career, a trip, a family gathering, a simple afternoon with friends. All of those possible moments disappear at once. Jordan Segura was another of the young people inside the house. Like the others, he belonged to a generation standing at the threshold of adulthood. University life can feel like a bridge between 2 worlds. Behind you is childhood. Ahead is adulthood. Everything seems possible. Your decisions begin to shape the rest of your life, but you are still young enough to believe there will always be more time. More semesters. More weekends. More summers. More nights like this. For Jordan, that assumption ended inside a house where he had expected nothing more dangerous than an ordinary gathering, because he managed to escape the house. That fact would later become one of the most haunting elements of the case. Josh was badly injured, yet somehow his body still found the strength to move. He got outside. He ran. Perhaps he knew only one thing: get away. The people who returned from the food run would see him. They would see the fear. They would see the violence that had followed him outside. And for a few moments, there was still hope that Josh might survive. Emergency responders came quickly. He was taken for treatment. But the injuries were too severe. The young man who had fought his way out of the house would not make it home. Zachariah Rathwell was also among those killed. He had been near the kitchen when the attack began. That location would later become an important part of the reconstruction of the crime. But again, it is easy to focus so heavily on the mechanics of the attack that the person disappears behind them. Zachariah was not simply a victim in a police report. He had friends. He had a family. He had a personality. He had interests. He had experiences that existed independently of the man who killed him. And that distinction matters, because the story of a murder can sometimes make the offender appear larger than the victim. The killer becomes psychological analysis. The killer becomes the face associated with the case. But the victim is the reason the case matters. Without them, there is no crime story. There is only an offender. The 5 young people of Brentwood were the human center of what happened. Their deaths created the questions. Their families carried the consequences. Their absence became permanent. And as the investigation moved forward, the contrast between their ordinary lives and the extraordinary violence that ended them became increasingly painful. The evening had started with celebration. The students were nearing the end of another academic term. The kind of night that could have been remembered years later with laughter. Someone might have said, "Do you remember that party in Brentwood?" Someone might have remembered what food they ordered. Someone might have joked about how late they stayed up. Someone might have complained about being exhausted the next morning. Those are the memories people usually expect to make when they gather with friends. Not memories of police cars. Not memories of emergency lights. Not memories of blood on a residential lawn. Not memories of identifying a loved one who would never return. Yet within hours, that ordinary night had become something else entirely. The first reports began moving through Calgary. A stabbing. Multiple victims. A suspect were enough to shock the city. 5 deaths in one attack. 5 young people. A university community suddenly confronted with the knowledge that the victims could easily have been someone they knew. A classmate. A friend. A roommate. A person sitting beside them in a lecture. A person they had seen walking across campus. The distance between someone else's tragedy, and this could have been me, suddenly became very small. But for the families, there was no distance at all. The tragedy was already inside their homes. The phone calls began. The questions began. And then came the unbearable confirmation. Their loved one was dead. There are few sentences more devastating than that. It is a sentence that divides time. Before hearing it, there is still hope. After hearing it, hope becomes memory. For the people who loved the Brentwood 5, the morning of April 15th was not simply the morning after a terrible crime. It was the morning after their world had changed. The city would soon begin discussing Matthew DeGrude. News organizations would ask who he was. Investigators would examine his background. Psychiatrists would study his behavior. Lawyers would argue about his mental state. The public would debate whether he should be punished. But families were dealing with something much simpler and much more. Friends were gone. Their loved ones would not walk through the door again. And while the legal system would eventually spend years trying to understand Matthew's mind, the families had to begin learning how to live with the consequences. This is where the story of Brentwood becomes more than a crime investigation. It becomes a story about the fragility of ordinary life. Most people assume tomorrow will come. We make plans without thinking about it. We say goodbye expecting to say hello again. We leave a house expecting to return. We go to a party expecting to go home. We fall asleep expecting to wake up. The 5 people in that house believed those things too. That is what makes the case so unsettling. There was no reason for them to imagine that the ordinary rules of life were about to disappear. And perhaps that is why the story continues to resonate. Because the horror was not hidden in some remote location. It was not happening in a place everyone understood to be dangerous. It happened in a familiar residential neighborhood, among young people, during a celebration, inside a house where friends were supposed to be safe. The setting could hardly have been more ordinary. The outcome could hardly have been more extraordinary. And at the center of the tragedy stood Matthew DeGrude, a 22-year-old man whose behavior had already begun to change. The signs had been there, understands what they mean. A strange message can be ignored. A bizarre statement can be dismissed. A paranoid thought can sound like a bad joke. Talk about vampires can seem absurd. Talk about the apocalypse can be written off as eccentricity. A person buying garlic because he believes vampires are real can appear strange without necessarily appearing dangerous. But taken together, those details painted a different picture. Something was happening inside Matthew's mind. Something that the people around him could not fully see. Something that would eventually become central to the case. In the hours before the murders, he was not simply behaving oddly. According to the evidence later presented, his thinking had become increasingly detached from reality. He was developing beliefs that were impossible for those around him to share. He believed there were forces around him that were threatening him. He interpreted ordinary people through a framework of supernatural and conspiratorial ideas. His internal world was becoming more convincing to him than the physical world around him. And that is where the psychological mystery begins. Because psychosis is not simply acting crazy. It is not a performance. It can alter the way a person perceives reality itself. A person experiencing psychosis may see danger where none exists. They may hear voices other people can to a pattern. They may become convinced that strangers, friends, or family members are part of a conspiracy. To the person experiencing it, those beliefs can feel completely real. There may be no sense of pretending, no awareness that the thoughts are irrational. The imagined threat can become more powerful than evidence standing directly in front of the person. And if that happens at the same time as fear, paranoia, and access to a weapon, the consequences can be catastrophic. That does not explain away the deaths. It does not make the suffering of the families smaller. But it helps explain why the legal questions surrounding Matthew DeGrood became so complex. The courtroom would eventually have to examine not simply what he did, but what he believed he was doing. Did he understand that the 5 people were innocent? Did he understand that stabbing them could kill them? Did he understand that his actions were wrong? Or had his mind constructed a reality in which he genuinely believed he was fighting for his own survival? Those questions would become the heart of the case. But before judges and psychiatrists examined them, investigators had to reconstruct the night. Every minute mattered. Every movement mattered. Every statement mattered. The knife mattered. The people who left the house mattered. The people who returned mattered. Josh's attempt to escape mattered. 911 call mattered. Matthew's statements after the attack mattered. And the strange behavior that had appeared before the murders mattered most of all. Investigators would begin connecting those pieces. The house would be examined. Witnesses would be interviewed. The surviving evidence would be preserved. Matthew would undergo psychiatric evaluation. And eventually, the entire story would move from a residential street in Calgary into a courtroom. But for the families, the most important evidence was not a knife or a message or a psychiatric report. It was a photograph, a voice, a memory, a favorite song, a childhood story, a piece of clothing left behind, a room that would never again contain the person who once lived inside it. That is the part of a murder case that statistics cannot capture. 5 deaths can be written in one sentence. 5 names can fit on one page. But grief does not work that way. Grief expands. It fills rooms. It appears in silence. It arrives unexpectedly while driving, eating, walking, or hearing a familiar song. It returns on birthdays. It returns during holidays. It returns when someone reaches for the phone before remembering that the person they want to call is gone. For the families of Lawrence, Katie, Jordan, 2014 became a permanent point of reference. Everything before it belonged to one life. Everything after it belonged to another. And as Calgary tried to understand what had happened in Brentwood, the 5 victims slowly became known collectively as the Brentwood 5. But they should never be allowed to remain only a collective name. Lawrence was Lawrence. Katie was Katie. Jordan was Jordan. Josh was Josh. Zachariah was Zachariah. 5 separate lives. 5 separate personalities. 5 separate families. 5 separate futures. And 5 empty spaces left behind. The tragedy of Brentwood was not simply that 5 people died in one night. It was that 5 lives that should have continued were suddenly interrupted. The people who loved them were forced to carry memories instead of making new ones. The city was left with questions. The investigators were left with evidence. The courts were left with a difficult legal problem. And Matthew DeGrood was left at the center of a case that would force Canada to confront an uncomfortable question about the boundary between mental illness and criminal responsibility. But before the courtroom could answer that question, the investigators needed to understand the night itself. What happened inside the house? How did the attack begin? Why did it happen so quickly? What exactly did the witness mind during those final moments? To answer those questions, we have to return to Butler Crescent. Back to the house. Back to the final ordinary moments. Back to the moment when several friends walked out the front door to get food, believing they would soon return. They did return, but they did not return to the same world. The house they had left as a place of friendship had become a crime scene. The friends they had left behind were dying, and the young man who had been standing among them only moments earlier was running through the night. The celebration was over. The investigation had begun, and the true story of the Brentwood Five was only beginning to unfold. Calgary is a city that can make distance feel enormous. It stretches outward beneath a wide prairie sky, a place where residential neighborhoods, roads, parks, and university buildings form a landscape that can appear almost limitless. To someone unfamiliar with the city, Calgary can seem defined by its size and openness. There are long roads, broad horizons, and neighborhoods where houses stand quietly behind lawns and driveways. But within that enormous city are smaller worlds. Communities where people know the streets by memory, where the same houses are passed every day, where students walk familiar routes between classes and home, where a person can live for years without ever imagining that a particular street. Brentwood was one of those places. Located in the northwest of Calgary, the community had a distinctly residential character. It was close to the University of Calgary, and that proximity helped shape the rhythm of life in the area. Students lived nearby. Young people moved through the neighborhood on their way to classes, part-time jobs, grocery stores, restaurants, and gatherings with friends. For many university students, neighborhoods like Brentwood were not simply places to sleep between classes. They were extensions of campus life. Friends visited each other's homes. Small gatherings happened without much planning. Someone might finish a late lecture and walk to a friend's house. Someone else might stop by after studying. The boundary between university and neighborhood life could become almost invisible. That was the world surrounding the house on Butler Crescent. Nothing about the street suggested danger. There was no ominous landmark, no abandoned building, no isolated industrial area, no reputation for violence that would make residents suspicious of a gathering there. It was a residential street, a place where ordinary life happened, and that ordinary quality would make the events of April 15th, 2014 even more difficult for people to comprehend. The house itself had been transformed, at least temporarily, into an end. For students, the end of a semester can feel like reaching the top of a long staircase. Weeks of work have accumulated behind you. Assignments have been completed. Exams are finished or nearly finished. The pressure begins to loosen. There is a sense that summer is waiting just beyond the next few days. The future feels open. Plans are made casually because there is still plenty of time to change them. For some students, the next chapter might involve returning home. For others, summer employment. For others, travel. For others, simply sleeping late and enjoying a few weeks without deadlines. But whatever their plans were, the people gathered at the Brentwood house were sharing a familiar experience. They were young. They were approaching a transition. And they were spending one of those nights that seem insignificant while they are happening. The kind of night that normally disappears into memory. A few years later, people might not remember exactly what they talked about. They might remember laughing. They might remember someone's joke. They might remember what food was ordered. They might remember who arrived first and who stayed late. But nobody expected that the location itself would become permanently associated with death. That is one of the strange things about places connected to tragedy. Before the crime, a house is just a house. A street, afterward, every ordinary detail becomes part of a story. A driveway becomes part of the route taken by emergency responders. A front lawn becomes part of the crime scene. A doorway becomes the place through which people entered and exited during the final minutes of someone's life. A room becomes the location where a victim was found. The physical environment remains unchanged, but its meaning changes forever. For the people who knew the victims, Butler Crescent would never again be an ordinary address. But on April 14th, 2014, none of that had happened yet. The neighborhood was simply part of Calgary. And Calgary itself was carrying on with the quiet confidence of a city expecting tomorrow to arrive normally. The city had grown enormously over the previous decades. It was a place of universities, businesses, families, construction, young professionals, and students. The University of Calgary added another layer to that identity. The campus was not isolated from the city. It was integrated into it. Students lived in surrounding communities. They traveled through neighborhoods. They made friends who lived off campus. They built social circles that crossed between classrooms and private homes. That meant that a tragedy involving university students could never remain confined to one house. The emotional shock would spread through campus. It would hear rumors before official details were available. People would begin asking who was there, who had survived, who had been injured, who was missing. And eventually, the devastating answer would become clear. 5 young people were dead. The number itself would become a symbol. 5. Not 1. Not 2. 5. The largest mass killing Calgary had experienced at the time. The word massacre would eventually be used. But before the city knew any of that, there was simply a gathering. There is something important about slowing down here. Because when we tell stories about crimes, we often rush toward the moment of violence. We want to know what happened. Who did it? How? Why? But the violence represents only a few minutes. The lives affected by it stretch across decades. That is why the setting matters. The house mattered because of what it represented before the murders. It was a place where young people could gather without thinking about danger. It was part of a community where people expected ordinary life. The victims were not entering a battlefield. They were not knowingly placing themselves in a dangerous environment. They were spending time with people they trusted. That trust would become one of the most painful unknown person who appeared at the door from nowhere. He was connected to the group. He was someone whose presence did not immediately trigger fear. That distinction separates Brentwood from many other mass killings. There was no obvious external threat. The danger was already inside the social circle. And yet, even that description is incomplete. Because Matthew himself was also a young man who had been living in the same world. He had a family. He had a father who worked in law enforcement. He had his own history, relationships, ambitions, and experiences. There was no simple line dividing the people inside the house into normal people and a monster. The later evidence would show something much more complicated. A severe psychiatric crisis. A mind increasingly overwhelmed by delusions. A young man whose perception of reality was changing. That complexity would make the case difficult for everyone involved. For the public, it was tempting to ask for a simple explanation. Was he evil? Was he mentally ill? Was he both? Was there a warning? Could someone have stopped him? But human behavior rarely fits neatly into a single sentence. The criminal justice system would eventually have to separate moral emotion from legal responsibility. The families would have to separate grief from the legal outcome. That mental illness can sometimes be associated with terrifying behavior, while the vast majority of people suffering from mental illness are not violent. The case would also expose how difficult it can be to recognize a psychiatric crisis before it becomes a catastrophe. Looking backward, Matthew's behavior appeared increasingly alarming. But at the time, the signs were scattered. He talked about vampires. He bought garlic. He discussed the apocalypse. He focused on a blood moon. He appeared to believe that other people were talking about him. These details might sound almost surreal when listed together. But that is precisely why they could be difficult to interpret in real time. People do not usually assume that a strange conversation is the beginning of a murder. They assume someone is joking. They assume someone is stressed. They assume someone is being eccentric. They assume tomorrow will be normal. That assumption is one of the foundations of everyday life. Without it, ordinary existence would become impossible. Imagine living every day assuming that every unusual comment could signal imminent violence. Every strange message would become a warning. Every unusual behavior would become a potential emergency. Society cannot function that way. So people interpret behavior through ordinary explanations. And on the night of April 14th, that his internal world had become dangerously distorted. The gathering continued. Young people moved through the house. The hours passed. Outside, Calgary grew quieter. The later the night became, the fewer people remained awake in the surrounding homes. Streetlights illuminated the roads. The university area settled into the strange stillness that comes after midnight. Inside the house, the group was gradually winding down. Then came the decision to get food. Several people left for McDonald's. It was a mundane decision. One of those tiny choices that usually has no consequences beyond hunger being satisfied. But in this case, it changed the number of people inside the house. The group became smaller. And the people who left had no reason to think they were leaving anyone in danger. They did not know what was happening inside Matthew's mind. They did not know that the house was about to become the location of 5 murders. They did not know that the next time they would see some of their friends, those friends would be dying. The tragedy of that moment is impossible to capture completely, because the decision to leave was so ordinary. No one was running from danger. No one was calling for help. No one was saying goodbye. They were simply going to get food. And then, somewhere between their departure and their return, the ordinary world disappeared. Josh Hunter, Katie Paris, and Jordan Segura remained in the living room. Zachariah Rathwell was near the kitchen. Matthew was there. The arrangement was almost frozen in time. 5 people who had no idea what was about to happen. One person whose mind had become consumed by beliefs that the others did not share. Then the knife appeared. The first violence was directed toward Zachariah. From there, Matthew moved through the house. Josh, Jordan, Katie, Lawrence. The details would later be reconstructed by investigators and witnesses. But the essential fact remained brutally simple. 5 people had been attacked. The assault lasted less than a minute. Then Josh Hunter somehow got outside. His attempt to escape changed the sequence of events. The returning friends saw him. They saw Matthew. They realized that something was terribly wrong. Brendan followed. The knife was handed over. The strange words were spoken. The 911 call was made. And the emergency response began. At that point, Brentwood ceased to be merely a neighborhood. It became the center of one of Calgary's most shocking criminal investigations. Police officers arrived. Paramedics arrived. The first responders faced a scene that would remain with them. The surviving injured were transported for treatment. But despite medical efforts, Josh Hunter and Katie Paris would die. 5 lives had been lost. The scale of the crime began to become clear. And outside the immediate crime scene, another story was already developing. The suspect was gone. Police needed to find him. The man they were searching for was Matthew DeGrood. His father, Doug DeGrood, was a respected veteran officer. That connection was almost impossible for the public to ignore. The case was already shocking because 5 university-age people had been killed. Now the suspect's family connection to the police added another layer. For Calgary's police community, the crime was personal in a way that was difficult to describe. But professional duty remained. The suspect had to be located. The public had to be protected. And the truth had to be established. Matthew was found roughly half an hour later. The immediate search ended. But the search for an explanation was only beginning. Investigators now had to reconstruct the sequence. They had to determine what had happened before the attack. They had to understand what happened inside the house. They had to identify every witness. They had to examine Matthew's statements. And they had to determine whether his behavior in the days before the killings provided clues to what had happened. This was investigation, because evidence suggested that Matthew's mind had been deteriorating before April 15th. His beliefs had become increasingly bizarre. His messages had become increasingly unusual. His fears had become increasingly detached from ordinary reality. And yet he had still been able to move through the world. He could talk to people. He could travel. He could buy things. He could attend a gathering. He could appear, at least superficially, like a young man participating in ordinary life. That contradiction would become central. How impaired can someone be while still appearing functional? How far can psychosis progress before the people around the person realize that something is seriously wrong? And most importantly, what happens when a person who cannot distinguish reality from delusion encounters people he believes are threatening him? The Brentwood case would force those questions into public view. But first, investigators needed to understand the man at the center of them. Matthew's background, his family, his behavior, his relationships, his psychological history. and the changes that had taken place shortly before the murders. Because if the attack was not the beginning of the story, then the real question was simple. When did it begin? Was it weeks earlier? Days earlier? Recognize them. The answer would emerge slowly, piece by piece, message by message, memory by memory, and eventually, through the testimony of experts who would attempt to reconstruct the world Matthew believed he was living in. But there was another story unfolding alongside his. The story of the 5 victims. As investigators focused on the accused, families were beginning the most painful process imaginable. They were learning that the person they loved would never come home. They were being asked to understand a tragedy that made no sense. They were forced to hear the same questions again and again. Who was responsible? Why did it happen? Could it have been prevented? What happens now? Those questions would follow them for years, and the answers would never completely heal the wound. Because no court decision could restore Lawrence Hong. No psychiatric diagnosis could restore Kaidi Paris. No legal ruling could restore Jordan Segura. No sentence could restore Josh Hunter. No verdict could restore Zachariah Rathwell. The legal system could only decide what to do with the man responsible. It could not reverse time. That is why the Brentwood 5 murders became more than a case about guilt. They became a case about responsibility, about mental illness, about justice. What he should do when a person commits an extraordinary act of violence while apparently detached from reality. Those questions were still far away on the morning of April 15th. At that moment, there was only a neighborhood waking to tragedy, a university community waking to shock, 5 families waking to grief, and investigators standing inside a house trying to understand how an ordinary celebration had become a massacre. The answers would not come quickly. They would have to reconstruct the night one piece at a time. They would have to look backward, before the knife, before the blood, before the 911 call, before the arrest. Back to the days when Matthew's behavior first began changing. Back to the strange messages. Back to the fear of vampires. Back to the talk of the apocalypse. Back to a young man whose mind was becoming a place of threats that no one else could see. That was the road the investigation would now follow. And the deeper investigators went into that world, the more complicated the Brentwood 5 case would become. To understand what happened in Brentwood, it is not enough to look at the house. The walls, the rooms, the furniture, the street outside, the time on the clock. Those details can tell investigators where the killings happened and how quickly they unfolded. But they cannot explain why. For that, they had to look inside Matthew DeGrude's mind. And that was a difficult place to reconstruct. The human mind leaves no crime scene photographs. There is no bloodstain that can reveal exactly what someone believed. There is no fingerprint that can prove when reality began to fracture. There are only fragments, messages, words, memories, statements from friends and relatives, medical observations, behavior that seemed strange at the time but became significant after the tragedy. And in Matthew's case, those fragments painted an increasingly disturbing picture. In the days before the murders, something had changed. Matthew was 22 years old. From the outside, he was a young man moving through a familiar stage of life. He had a family. He had friends. He was connected to the university environment. He could participate in ordinary social activities. He could communicate with other people. There was nothing about his appearance that would necessarily tell a stranger that he was experiencing a severe psychiatric crisis. That is one of the most difficult aspects of psychosis to understand. A person can look completely ordinary while experiencing a world that is anything but ordinary. They can walk down a street while believing someone is following them. They can sit in a room they can have a conversation while hearing voices that nobody else can hear. They can look at a friend and see an enemy. And if the person is not aware that these perceptions are symptoms of illness, the imagined world may feel more convincing than the physical one. There is no simple switch between sanity and madness. The deterioration can happen gradually. One unusual thought becomes another. One fear grows into a belief. A suspicion becomes certainty. An unrelated event becomes evidence. And eventually, the person can find themselves living inside a reality that everyone else around them cannot see. Evidence later presented in the Brentwood case suggested that Matthew had been moving in that direction. His communications had become increasingly unusual. His thoughts appeared increasingly disorganized. He became preoccupied with ideas that most people would immediately recognize as irrational. Among those ideas were vampires. It might sound almost absurd when described from a distance. A young man buying garlic because he believed vampires posed a real threat. But that is precisely why the detail is important. To someone outside the belief, it sounds ridiculous. To someone inside it, the danger can feel completely genuine. Imagine waking in the middle of the night, convinced that something is hunting you. Imagine looking around for protective power. Imagine seeing other people and wondering whether they are hiding something. Then imagine being told by everyone around you that none of it is real. If your mind has already begun to disconnect from reality, their reassurance may not calm you. It may make you more suspicious. Because if the threat is real in your mind, then anyone who denies it can appear to be part of the threat. That is one way paranoia can trap a person inside itself. The more people disagree with the belief, the more isolated the person can become. And the more isolated they become, the stronger the belief may feel. Matthew's thoughts were not limited to vampires. He also talked about the apocalypse. He became focused on the blood moon. These ideas appeared together in a way that suggested his mind was constructing a larger narrative. The world was no longer simply the world. It had become a place filled with signs. Events had meanings. People had hidden identities. Danger seemed to be everywhere. To an outside observer, these beliefs could appear disconnected. But inside a delusional system, unrelated details can become connected. A conversation becomes evidence. A look becomes a signal. A coincidence becomes a warning. A person's silence becomes suspicious. A harmless event becomes proof that the threat is real. That is why examining Matthew's state of mind. They were not trying to determine whether his beliefs were strange. They were trying to determine whether those beliefs had become so powerful that they had fundamentally altered his ability to understand reality. And that distinction would eventually become critical in court. But before the courtroom, there were the people who encountered Matthew during those final days. They saw pieces of the change. Some heard strange things. Some received unusual messages. Some noticed that his behavior was different. But nobody had a complete map of what was happening. That is another painful lesson of the case. A psychiatric crisis is often easier to recognize after catastrophe than before it. Once the ending is known, the beginning becomes obvious. The strange messages are no longer just strange. The bizarre comments are no longer just bizarre. The fear of vampires is no longer something that can be dismissed as eccentric. The talk of the apocalypse becomes a warning sign. But on April 14th, the people around Matthew did not know the ending. They were not detectives. They were not psychiatrists. They were friends. They were young people attending a gathering. They were living in the moment. And that moment still looked ordinary. The night continued. Matthew was among them. The others did not know that the boundaries between become dangerously blurred. There is another detail that would later attract enormous attention. Matthew's father was Doug DeGrude, a senior and experienced police officer. This meant that Matthew had grown up in a world where the concepts of law, crime, evidence, and police work were not abstract. They were part of his family environment. That connection would make the tragedy especially painful. But it also complicated the public's understanding of him. People often want a criminal case to fit a familiar pattern. They want to know whether someone came from a violent family, whether there was a history of cruelty, whether the person had always been dangerous, whether the warning signs were obvious. But the Brentwood case did not provide such a simple story. The person accused of killing 5 people was not described simply as a lifelong violent predator. The evidence pointed instead toward a severe psychiatric breakdown. That does not make the killings less horrific. It makes them harder to understand. A calculated killer can be placed inside a familiar narrative. Motive. Planning. Opportunity. Execution. But what happens when the person does not believe the world is what it actually is? What happens when the killer believes the victims are enemies? What happens when the person believes violence is necessary for survival? But first came the night itself. The gathering at Butler Crescent was already underway. The people there had no idea that Matthew's thoughts had become so detached from reality. The house remained a social space. There were conversations. There was movement. People were comfortable enough to stay late. That comfort matters. Because comfort is a form of trust. When people feel unsafe, they leave. When they believe someone is dangerous, they create distance. The people at the house did neither. They remained. They talked. They spent time together. At some point, the group decided to go out for food. That decision would later become a crucial turning point. Several people left. For them, it was temporary. They expected to return. The people who stayed behind remained inside. The number of people in the house became smaller. The atmosphere was quieter. And Matthew remained there. If anyone had looked at the group from outside at that exact moment, there would have been nothing remarkable about it. A house. A late night. Young people. A neighborhood. But history had already begun moving toward them. Matthew went toward the kitchen. A knife became a weapon. And suddenly the internal world he had been experiencing collided with the physical world. The attempt. Then the violence moved through the house. Josh Hunter. Jordan Segura. Katie Paris. Lawrence Hong. 5 people attacked in a matter of seconds. There is a tendency to imagine a massacre as something that must take a long time. People picture chaos stretching across minutes or hours. But the Brentwood attack was extraordinarily fast. The violence was over in less than a minute. And that speed created another disturbing question. How did the victims have so little time to understand what was happening? One moment, the house was a gathering. The next, people were fighting for their lives. The human brain needs time to process danger. When something unexpected happens, there can be a brief period of disbelief. What is happening? Is this real? Why is this happening? Can I stop it? By the time those questions are forming, the event may already be over. That may have been part of the terror of those final moments. The victims were not prepared. They had no reason to expect an attack. The person attacking them was someone within their social environment. There was no warning that the night had changed. Then Josh Hunter escaped outside. That moment created a second phase of the tragedy. The people returning from McDonald's saw him. They saw Matthew. They realized something to buy food had suddenly placed them directly in the aftermath. Brendan followed Matthew. The knife was handed to him. The strange words followed. The night of the long knives. Blood brothers. Those statements would remain among the most disturbing details of the case because they suggested that Matthew was interpreting what had happened through a bizarre internal narrative. He was not simply standing there in silence. He was assigning meaning to the event. He seemed to be acting within a reality that was different from everyone else's. Then the police were called. Emergency responders arrived, and Matthew disappeared into the night. The police response was immediate, but the psychological investigation had already begun. What had happened to this young man? What had he believed? When had those beliefs started? And why had they become so powerful? The answers would come partly from the days leading up to the killings. Matthew had reportedly become increasingly convinced that people were talking about him. That kind of paranoia can be especially destabilizing. A person may begin to interpret ordinary behavior as hostile. 2 strangers whispering across a room may seem to be discussing him. Someone laughing may appear to be laughing at him. A friend asking a normal question may seem to have hidden motives. The world begins to feel personal. Everything's evidence that contradicts the belief. The absence of evidence can itself become evidence. If nobody admits they are talking about him, perhaps they are hiding it. If someone says they are not involved, perhaps that is proof they are involved. There is no easy way out of a belief system like that. Eventually, the person can become trapped. According to the evidence later presented in court, Matthew's delusions became increasingly elaborate. He believed that he had a special identity. He associated himself with religious and historical figures. He believed other people were members of secret or supernatural groups. He saw enemies where ordinary people existed. And he reported hearing a male voice that he believed was Satan. The voice, according to evidence presented later, told him to kill the 5 people before they could kill him. That detail is crucial because it provides a possible explanation for the violence from inside Matthew's distorted reality. He did not believe he was simply attacking innocent people. He believed he was responding to an existential threat. In his mind, the situation had already become a fight for survival. This is where the distinction between explanation and justification becomes essential. Understanding why someone acted does not mean approving of what they did. A psychiatric illness can explain behavior without making the consequences disappear. Still suffered. The community was still traumatized. The question was whether Matthew's illness had reached a level that legally prevented him from understanding the nature and wrongfulness of his actions. That question would become the central issue at trial. But the trial was still years away. In the immediate aftermath, Matthew was taken into custody. The police investigation moved quickly. The evidence against him was overwhelming in terms of physical responsibility. There were witnesses. There was the weapon. There was his presence at the scene. There were his own statements. The mystery was not primarily about who had committed the killings. The mystery was why. And the answer seemed to lie somewhere inside a mind that had become increasingly disconnected from reality. As investigators gathered information, they began looking at Matthew's behavior before April 15th. The garlic. The vampires. The apocalypse. The blood moon. The messages. The paranoia. The strange beliefs. Each detail was a piece of a much larger puzzle. But investigators also had to be careful. Strange behavior does not automatically equal psychosis. Unusual beliefs do not automatically make someone legally insane. A person can say something bizarre and still be criminally responsible. The law does not simply ask whether someone was mentally ill. It asks how that illness affected their ability to understand their actions. That distinction would eventually become the foundation of the courtroom battle. For now, however, the city was dealing with the immediate shock. 5 young people were dead. The university community was grieving. Families were trying to understand how a night that began with friends could end with 5 funerals. And the house on Butler Crescent stood as the physical symbol of everything that had gone wrong. The ordinary objects inside it had become evidence. The rooms had become locations in a timeline. The people who had been there became witnesses. And Matthew became the center of an investigation unlike anything Calgary had seen before. The story would soon move into psychiatric hospitals and courtrooms. Experts would debate his mental state. Lawyers would examine his words. Witnesses would describe his behavior. And the families would have to sit through testimony that forced them to hear, again and again, how their loved ones had died. But before all of that, there was one fundamental truth. 5 people were gone. 5 families were grieving. And a 22-year-old man was now in custody after one of the most devastating acts of violence in Calgary's history. The question was no longer whether the warning signs had been visible before the tragedy. And if they had been visible, why had nobody been able to stop what came next? That question has no simple answer. People do not always recognize mental illness when it appears. Families may hesitate to intervene. Friends may assume strange behavior will pass. A person experiencing psychosis may resist help because, from their perspective, there is nothing wrong with them. If they believe the danger is real, they may believe everyone else is the problem. That can make intervention extraordinarily difficult. And in Matthew's case, the internal threat had become so convincing that he ultimately believed the people around him were the ones who needed to die. The tragedy of Brentwood was therefore not created in a single instant. The physical violence happened in less than a minute. But the psychological crisis behind it had been developing before that night. The knife was only the final expression of a process that investigators would spend years trying to understand. That process began with small changes. Strange thoughts. Strange fears. Strange messages. Then stronger beliefs. Then paranoia. Then a complete distortion of reality. And finally, violence. The 5 people in the house never saw that progression coming. They could not know that the young man standing was increasingly dangerous. They could not know that his fears had begun to take on the power of facts. They could not know that the person they saw was no longer experiencing the same reality they were. And when the attack came, they had almost no time to understand it. That is why the story of Brentwood cannot be understood simply by looking at the final minute. To understand that minute, investigators had to go backward. They had to examine Matthew's behavior before the gathering. They had to understand the development of his psychosis. They had to examine the beliefs that eventually shaped his actions. And they had to determine whether those beliefs were symptoms of a serious mental illness or something else. The answers would eventually come from psychiatrists, witnesses, family members, investigators, and Matthew himself. But every answer would raise another question. Because the deeper the investigation went, the more difficult the case became. There was no denying the deaths. There was no denying the horror. There was no denying the devastation. But behind the violence was a mind that appeared to have stopped interpreting reality in the way everyone else did. And that was the mystery that would eventually dominate the courtroom. Not whether 5 people had died. Not whether Matthew had attacked them. But whether the person who committed those acts understood what he was doing. For the families, however, the legal questions were still gone. Their memories were still fresh. Their grief was still beginning. And while the justice system prepared to examine Matthew's mind, the families were beginning a different kind of investigation. They were searching through photographs, messages, memories, stories, everything that could preserve the people they had lost. Because the law would eventually decide what happened to Matthew. But nobody could decide that the 5 victims should be forgotten. And that is why the next part of the story must move away from the killer, away from the courtroom, away from the psychiatric diagnosis, and toward the people whose lives were interrupted that night. To understand what was lost in Brentwood, we have to meet them not as victims, but as people, before the crime, before the headlines, before their names were joined together forever. 5 young lives were moving forward. And then, in a house on Butler Crescent, that future stopped. To understand what happened in Brentwood, it is not enough to look at the house. The walls, the rooms, the furniture, the street outside, the time on the clock, those details can tell investigators where the killings happened and how quickly they unfolded. But they cannot explain why. For that, investigators had to look somewhere much harder to reach. They had to look inside Matthew DeGrude's mind. And that was it leaves no crime scene photographs. There is no bloodstain that can reveal exactly what someone believed. There is no fingerprint that can prove when reality began to fracture. There are only fragments, messages, words, memories, statements from friends and relatives, medical observations, behavior that seemed strange at the time but became significant after the tragedy. And in Matthew's case, those fragments painted an increasingly disturbing picture. In the days before the murders, something had changed. Matthew was 22 years old. From the outside, he was a young man moving through a familiar stage of life. He had a family. He had friends. He was connected to the university environment. He could participate in ordinary social activities. He could communicate with other people. There was nothing about his appearance that would necessarily tell a stranger that he was experiencing a severe psychiatric crisis. That is one of the most difficult aspects of psychosis to understand. A person can look completely ordinary while experiencing a world that is anything but ordinary. They can walk down a street while believing someone is following them. They can sit in a room while believing the people around them are part of a conspiracy. They can have a conversation while hearing a friend and see an enemy. And if the person is not aware that these perceptions are symptoms of illness, the imagined world may feel more convincing than the physical one. There is no simple switch between sanity and madness. The deterioration can happen gradually. One unusual thought becomes another. One fear grows into a belief. A suspicion becomes certainty. An unrelated event becomes evidence. And eventually, the person can find themselves living inside a reality that everyone else around them cannot see. Evidence later presented in the Brentwood case suggested that Matthew had been moving in that direction. His communications had become increasingly unusual. His thoughts appeared increasingly disorganized. He became preoccupied with ideas that most people would immediately recognize as irrational. Among those ideas were vampires. It might sound almost absurd when described from a distance. A young man buying garlic because he believed vampires posed a real threat. But that is precisely why the detail is important. To someone outside the belief, it sounds ridiculous. To someone inside it, the danger can feel completely genuine. Imagine waking in the middle of the night, convinced that something is hunting you. Imagine looking around a room and believing that an ordinary object has protective power. Imagine being told by everyone around you that none of it is real. If your mind has already begun to disconnect from reality, their reassurance may not calm you. It may make you more suspicious. Because if the threat is real in your mind, then anyone who denies it can appear to be part of the threat. That is one way paranoia can trap a person inside itself. The more people disagree with the belief, the more isolated the person can become. And the more isolated they become, the stronger the belief may feel. Matthew's thoughts were not limited to vampires. He also talked about the apocalypse. He became focused on the blood moon. These ideas appeared together in a way that suggested his mind was constructing a larger narrative. The world was no longer simply the world. It had become a place filled with signs. Events had meanings. People had hidden identities. Danger seemed to be everywhere. To an outside observer, these beliefs could appear disconnected. But inside a delusional system, unrelated details can become connected. A conversation becomes evidence. A look becomes a signal. A coincidence becomes a warning. A person's silence becomes suspicious. A harmless event becomes proof that the threat is real. That is why psychiatric experts would later spend so much time examining Matthew's state of mind. Strange. They were trying to determine whether those beliefs had become so powerful that they had fundamentally altered his ability to understand reality. And that distinction would eventually become critical in court. But before the courtroom, there were the people who encountered Matthew during those final days. They saw pieces of the change. Some heard strange things. Some received unusual messages. Some noticed that his behavior was different. But nobody had a complete map of what was happening. That is another painful lesson of the case. A psychiatric crisis is often easier to recognize after catastrophe than before it. Once the ending is known, the beginning becomes obvious. The strange messages are no longer just strange. The bizarre comments are no longer just bizarre. The fear of vampires is no longer something that can be dismissed as eccentric. The talk of the apocalypse becomes a warning sign. But on April 14th, the people around Matthew did not know the ending. They were not detectives. They were not psychiatrists. They were friends. They were young people attending a gathering. They were living in the moment. And that moment still looked ordinary. The night continued. Matthew was among them. The others did not know that the boundaries between his internal reality and the physical world had become dangerously blurred. Enormous attention. Matthew's father was Doug DeGrude, a senior and experienced police officer. This meant that Matthew had grown up in a world where the concepts of law, crime, evidence, and police work were not abstract. They were part of his family environment. That connection would make the tragedy especially painful. But it also complicated the public's understanding of him. People often want a criminal case to fit a familiar pattern. They want to know whether someone came from a violent family, whether there was a history of cruelty, whether the person had always been dangerous, whether the warning signs were obvious. But the Brentwood case did not provide such a simple story. The person accused of killing 5 people was not described simply as a lifelong violent predator. The evidence pointed instead toward a severe psychiatric breakdown. That does not make the killings less horrific. It makes them harder to understand. A calculated killer can be placed inside a familiar narrative. Motive. Planning. Opportunity. Execution. But what happens when the person does not believe the world is what it actually is? What happens when the killer believes the victims are enemies? What happens when the person believes violence is necessary for survival? Those questions would eventually become central to the legal case. Crescent was already underway. The people there had no idea that Matthew's thoughts had become so detached from reality. The house remained a social space. There were conversations. There was movement. People were comfortable enough to stay late. That comfort matters, because comfort is a form of trust. When people feel unsafe, they leave. When they believe someone is dangerous, they create distance. The people at the house did neither. They remained. They talked. They spent time together. At some point, the group decided to go out for food. That decision would later become a crucial turning point. Several people left. For them, it was temporary. They expected to return. The people who stayed behind remained inside. The number of people in the house became smaller. The atmosphere was quieter. And Matthew remained there. If anyone had looked at the group from outside at that exact moment, there would have been nothing remarkable about it. A house. A late night. Young people. A neighborhood. But history had already begun moving toward them. Matthew went toward the kitchen. A knife became a weapon. And suddenly the internal world he had been experiencing collided with the physical world. The attack began. Zachariah Rathwell was first. Then the violence, Jordan Segura, Katie Paris, Lawrence Hong. 5 people attacked in a matter of seconds. There is a tendency to imagine a massacre as something that must take a long time. People picture chaos stretching across minutes or hours. But the Brentwood attack was extraordinarily fast. The violence was over in less than a minute. And that speed created another disturbing question. How did the victims have so little time to understand what was happening? One moment, the house was a gathering. The next, people were fighting for their lives. The human brain needs time to process danger. When something unexpected happens, there can be a brief period of disbelief. What is happening? Is this real? Why is this happening? Can I stop it? By the time those questions are forming, the event may already be over. That may have been part of the terror of those final moments. The victims were not prepared. They had no reason to expect an attack. The person attacking them was someone within their social environment. There was no warning that the night had changed. Then Josh Hunter escaped outside. That moment created a second phase of the tragedy. The people returning from McDonald's saw him. They saw Matthew. They realized something catastrophic had happened. The ordinary decision to buy food had. Brendan followed Matthew. The knife was handed to him. The strange words followed. The night of the long knives. Blood brothers. Those statements would remain among the most disturbing details of the case because they suggested that Matthew was interpreting what had happened through a bizarre internal narrative. He was not simply standing there in silence. He was assigning meaning to the event. He seemed to be acting within a reality that was different from everyone else's. Then the police were called. Emergency responders arrived, and Matthew disappeared into the night. The police response was immediate, but the psychological investigation had already begun. What had happened to this young man? What had he believed? When had those beliefs started? And why had they become so powerful? The answers would come partly from the days leading up to the killings. Matthew had reportedly become increasingly convinced that people were talking about him. That kind of paranoia can be especially destabilizing. A person may begin to interpret ordinary behavior as hostile. 2 strangers whispering across a room may seem to be discussing him. Someone laughing may appear to be laughing at him. A friend asking a normal question may seem to have hidden motives. The world begins to feel personal. Everything seems connected. And when the person cannot find evidence that contradicts some evidence, if nobody admits they are talking about him, perhaps they are hiding it. If someone says they are not involved, perhaps that is proof they are involved. There is no easy way out of a belief system like that. Eventually, the person can become trapped. According to the evidence later presented in court, Matthew's delusions became increasingly elaborate. He believed that he had a special identity. He associated himself with religious and historical figures. He believed other people were members of secret or supernatural groups. He saw enemies where ordinary people existed. And he reported hearing a male voice that he believed was Satan. The voice, according to evidence presented later, told him to kill the 5 people before they could kill him. That detail is crucial because it provides a possible explanation for the violence from inside Matthew's distorted reality. He did not believe he was simply attacking innocent people. He believed he was responding to an existential threat. In his mind, the situation had already become a fight for survival. This is where the distinction between explanation and justification becomes essential. Understanding why someone acted does not mean approving of what they did. A psychiatric illness can explain behavior without making the consequences disappear. The 5 victims were still dead. Their families still suffered. It was whether Matthew's illness had reached a level that legally prevented him from understanding the nature and wrongfulness of his actions. That question would become the central issue at trial. But the trial was still years away. In the immediate aftermath, Matthew was taken into custody. The police investigation moved quickly. The evidence against him was overwhelming in terms of physical responsibility. There were witnesses. There was the weapon. There was his presence at the scene. There were his own statements. The mystery was not primarily about who had committed the killings. The mystery was why. And the answer seemed to lie somewhere inside a mind that had become increasingly disconnected from reality. As investigators gathered information, they began looking at Matthew's behavior before April 15th. The garlic. The vampires. The apocalypse. the blood moon, the messages, the paranoia, the strange beliefs. Each detail was a piece of a much larger puzzle. But investigators also had to be careful. Strange behavior does not automatically equal psychosis. Unusual beliefs do not automatically make someone legally insane. A person can say something bizarre and still understand reality. A person can have a mental illness. It does not simply ask whether someone was mentally ill. It asks how that illness affected their ability to understand their actions. That distinction would eventually become the foundation of the courtroom battle. For now, however, the city was dealing with the immediate shock. 5 young people were dead. The university community was grieving. Families were trying to understand how a night that began with friends could end with 5 funerals. And the house on Butler Crescent stood as the physical symbol of everything that had gone wrong. The ordinary objects inside it had become evidence. The rooms had become locations in a timeline. The people who had been there became witnesses. And Matthew became the center of an investigation unlike anything Calgary had seen before. The story would soon move into psychiatric hospitals and courtrooms. Experts would debate his mental state. Lawyers would examine his words. Witnesses would describe his behavior. And the families would have to sit through testimony that forced them to hear, again and again, how their loved ones had died. But before all of that, there was one fundamental truth. 5 people were gone. 5 families were grieving. And a 22-year-old man was now in custody after one of the most devastating acts of violence in Calgary's history. The question was no longer whether something terrible had happened. Everyone knew that, for the tragedy. And if they had been visible, why had nobody been able to stop what came next? That question has no simple answer. People do not always recognize mental illness when it appears. Families may hesitate to intervene. Friends may assume strange behavior will pass. A person experiencing psychosis may resist help because, from their perspective, there is nothing wrong with them. If they believe the danger is real, they may believe everyone else is the problem. That can make intervention extraordinarily difficult. And in Matthew's case, the internal threat had become so convincing that he ultimately believed the people around him were the ones who needed to die. The tragedy of Brentwood was therefore not created in a single instant. The physical violence happened in less than a minute. But the psychological crisis behind it had been developing before that night. The knife was only the final expression of a process that investigators would spend years trying to understand. That process began with small changes. Strange thoughts. Strange fears. Strange messages. Then stronger beliefs. Then paranoia. Then a complete distortion of reality. And finally, violence. The 5 people in the house never saw that progression coming. They could not know that the young man standing among them was living inside a world that his fears had begun to take on the power of facts. They could not know that the person they saw was no longer experiencing the same reality they were. And when the attack came, they had almost no time to understand it. That is why the story of Brentwood cannot be understood simply by looking at the final minute. To understand that minute, investigators had to go backward. They had to examine Matthew's behavior before the gathering. They had to understand the development of his psychosis. They had to examine the beliefs that eventually shaped his actions. And they had to determine whether those beliefs were symptoms of a serious mental illness or something else. The answers would eventually come from psychiatrists, witnesses, family members, investigators, and Matthew himself. But every answer would raise another question. Because the deeper the investigation went, the more difficult the case became. There was no denying the deaths. There was no denying the horror. There was no denying the devastation. But behind the violence was a mind that appeared to have stopped interpreting reality in the way everyone else did. And that was the mystery that would eventually dominate the courtroom. Not whether 5 people had died. Not whether Matthew had attacked them. But whether the person who committed those acts understood what he was doing. For the families, however, the legal question could never replace the human one. Their grief was still beginning. And while the justice system prepared to examine Matthew's mind, the families were beginning a different kind of investigation. They were searching through photographs, messages, memories, stories, everything that could preserve the people they had lost. Because the law would eventually decide what happened to Matthew. But nobody could decide that the 5 victims should be forgotten. And that is why the next part of the story must move away from the killer, away from the courtroom, away from the psychiatric diagnosis, and toward the people whose lives were interrupted that night. To understand what was lost in Brentwood, we have to meet them not as victims, but as people, before the crime, before the headlines, before their names were joined together forever. 5 young lives were moving forward. And then, in a house on Butler Crescent, that future stopped. By the time darkness settled over Calgary on April 14, 2014, Brentwood looked almost exactly as it had on countless other nights. The streets were familiar. The houses were quiet. The university was nearby, but the energy of the daytime campus had faded. Students who had spent hours moving between lectures, libraries, coffee shops, and residences were gradually disappearing into their homes. There was no visible sign that something extraordinary was approaching. No warning. No siren. No disturbance spreading through the neighborhood. Only the slow transition from evening into night. Inside the house on Butler Crescent, however, a group of young people were still awake. The semester was nearing its end, and there was something almost symbolic about that. University life is built around cycles. One term ends. Another begins. People move through exams and assignments, then emerge on the other side feeling temporarily free. The pressure that has occupied their minds for months suddenly loosens. There is time to talk about summer. Time to make plans. Time to stay up later than usual. Time to spend an evening with friends without thinking about tomorrow's lecture. That was the kind of atmosphere surrounding the gathering. Nobody had gathered because they expected danger. Nobody had come prepared for a confrontation. The house was not a fortress. It was not a place where people were watching doors and checking windows. It was simply a home where friends could spend time together. And perhaps that is what makes the events of the night so difficult to comprehend. The environment was built around trust. The people inside knew one another. They were not strangers sharing a dangerous space. They were friends. Matthew DeGrood was among them. He was 22. Young enough to be part of the same social world as the others. Old enough to be living at the point where childhood was becoming a distant memory and adult life was beginning to take shape. He had a family. He had relationships. He had a history. And yet, in the days leading up to that night, his behavior had begun to move away from what people around him considered normal. The strange ideas had accumulated. Vampires. Garlic. The apocalypse. The blood moon. People talking about him. Hidden threats. A world in which ordinary explanations no longer seemed sufficient. But even these details need to be understood carefully. The people around Matthew were not watching a movie in which the audience knows what will happen next. They were not given a narrator explaining that a catastrophe was approaching. They were simply living through a confusing series of moments. If someone said something strange, perhaps it was ignored. If someone sent an unusual message, perhaps the recipient did not know what to make of it. If someone behaved differently for a few days, perhaps friends assumed they were stressed. There are countless explanations for unusual behavior. Sleep deprivation, anxiety, alcohol, a bad mood, a difficult relationship, a strange sense of humor. People rarely jump immediately to the conclusion that someone they know is experiencing a severe psychotic episode. That is especially true when the person still looks like themselves. Matthew could still talk. He could still move around. He could still participate in social situations. There was no physical sign announcing that his perception of reality was changing. But inside his mind, according to the evidence later presented, the boundaries between imagination and reality were becoming dangerously weak. That distinction would eventually become the central issue of the entire case. At the time, however, the evening continued. People talked. The hours passed. The neighborhood grew quieter. The temperature dropped with the darkness. Calgary's streets became less crowded. The windows of surrounding homes glowed against the night. Inside the house, the group remained together. The late hour changed the rhythm. Some people became tired. Others stayed awake. The gathering gradually became smaller and more relaxed. There is a strange quality to late-night gatherings. At the beginning, everyone is alert. Conversations overlap. People move around. The room feels full. As the hours pass down, Someone checks their phone. Someone starts talking about food. Someone realizes they are hungry. Someone else decides it is time to go home. Those ordinary decisions eventually brought the night to the moment that changed everything. Several people decided to leave the house and get food from McDonald's. There was nothing suspicious about the decision. No one was escaping. No one was running. They were simply hungry. The people who left did not know that the house behind them was about to become the site of 5 murders. They did not know that their absence would create the exact circumstances in which the attack would occur. They did not know that the next few minutes would become permanently embedded in their memories. They left expecting to return. Inside, 5 people remained. Lawrence Hong was asleep on a couch. Josh Hunter, Katie Paris, and Jordan Segura were in the living room. Zachariah Rathwell was near the kitchen. Matthew was there as well. The house was now quieter. Fewer voices. Fewer movements. A smaller group. The kind of moment when people might naturally begin winding down. No one could see what was coming. That is important. Because when we know the ending, the scene can feel almost unbearably tense. The kitchen. The knife. The person whose mind had become consumed by delusions. We know what those details will become. The people inside did not. To them, the kitchen was simply the kitchen. The couch was simply a couch. The living room was simply where friends were sitting. The person standing among them was simply Matthew. That is the cruelest element of hindsight. We can see the danger because we know the ending. They could not. Then Matthew went toward the kitchen. The knife was taken. The first attack began. Zachariah Rathwell was struck. The change from ordinary gathering to deadly violence happened so quickly that there was almost no time to understand it. The room that had contained friendship now contained fear. The others were attacked. Josh Hunter, Jordan Segura, Katie Paris, Lawrence Hong. The attack moved rapidly. The entire sequence took less than a minute. Less than a minute. The number is almost impossible to reconcile with the scale of the consequences. 5 people would die. 5 families would be destroyed. A city would be shocked. A university community would be traumatized. A courtroom would eventually spend years examining the mind of the man responsible. And yet the physical violence itself was over in less than 60 seconds. Then Josh Hunter moved, somehow managed to get outside. He ran. Behind him came Matthew. The night outside was different from the chaos inside. The neighborhood remained quiet. The houses were still standing. The streetlights still illuminated the road. There were no crowds gathered to watch. No one outside had any idea that a massacre had just occurred. Josh ran into that ordinary darkness, carrying the reality of what had happened with him. Then the people who had gone to get food returned. They expected the night to continue. Instead, they saw something that instantly transformed their understanding of the evening. Josh was outside. Matthew was nearby. The danger was visible. The people returning did not need an explanation to know something was wrong. Brendan followed Matthew. The knife was eventually handed over. Then Matthew said the words that would later be repeated in court and in accounts of the case. The night of the long knives. Then he wiped his blood-covered hands onto Brendan's hands. Blood brothers. The words seemed disconnected from the horror surrounding them. The person standing there had just been involved in a massacre. Yet his language suggested something symbolic, almost ritualistic, as though the events had been transformed inside his mind into part of another story. Brendan called 911. The emergency response began, were dispatched. The machinery of crisis response moved quickly. Within minutes, emergency vehicles were arriving. The quiet residential neighborhood